Professor David Betz, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
Tell me a bit, before we launch into civil war and all of those things, tell me a little bit about your credentials.
I'm a professor in the War Studies Department at King's College London, where I've been for the last 25 years. I did my PhD here in the UK, but I'm Canadian originally. My area of interest has been, or essentially my academic title is Professor of War in the Modern World, which is pretty broad, but also indicative of my interest. I tend to be working on wherever the war is on a given time. For most of the last 25 years, I've been working on irregular war, and mostly the informational aspects or the psychological and dimension of irregular conflicts, because that's been the mainstream of conflict in our world for much of the time in which I've been a professional scholar on the issues. So that's essentially my background. I'm a mainstream academic in a well-known department in a quite reputable UK university with a particular specialism in irregular conflict.
Which is really important because, I mean, I've been saying for some time, oh gosh, I bet we're headed for civil war here. But I'm just an idiot and I know nothing. And I want viewers to remember that. But you're a proper person. And so, are we headed for civil war?
Yes, probably.
That's quite scary.
Yes, it is. It is scary. I agree.
Oh, okay. Well, where to begin? I mean, I suppose, what are the chances that it doesn't happen?
If it's a slightly complicated question, but I like to answer that, just on the basis of the existing literature and the consensus view, or at least in the estimation of what I think is probably the best recent work on the subject. Which is a book by the American scholar Barbara Walter, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them is the subtitle. She concludes that in any given year in which the conditions of civil war are present, the chances of it actually breaking out are about 4%. So my argument essentially is based around that number. I find it credible. People might interrogate her number, but for purposes of argument, I just accept that that 4% is reasonable. I'm convinced by her scholarship on that point. So if you look out over 5 years and you work out the maths of that in any one country, I just pick the UK, for example, it comes out to about 18.5%, or literally 18.61, I think it is, something like that. Anyway, the numbers, I'm not a quantitative political scientist. I'm not particularly obsessing over the numbers, but it comes out to somewhere around 18%.
But why is that?
That's just the way the maths work. If you accept that there's a 4% or do you mean what are the underlying conditions, or what?
Well, how do you get 18?
If you take on an annual basis, there is a 4% possibility of something occurring, and you project that out over 5 years, then the total aggregate potential over 5 years is 18%.
Okay.
Do you follow?
And it's very likely this would happen in the next 25 years. Is that? Can we extrapolate?
Well, I haven't gone that far. I tend to think more over the next 5 years, and when you could. From a statistical point of view, you could work the numbers out to 25 or 125 or 25,000. That's not the problem. I'm just I tend not to do that personally, because the underlying premise of the question are the existence of the conditions that are indicative of civil war, and I think that. One can show very convincingly, in my view, that currently those conditions exist, and they are very likely to continue to exist, and in fact, I suspect to magnify over the next 5 years or so. After this, much further than that, I wouldn't wish to
speculate.
wish to predict or speculate. I think I'm going as far as I might reasonably go. But it's essentially, in answer to your original question, if you start with 4%, you work it out over 5, you get to a number that's somewhere around 18. Then I think, however, which is a pretty scary figure, right? But it's worse than that, I think, when you think about it, because it's a very connected world. One of the most significant indicators of the likelihood of civil war breaking out in one place, all things being equal, is whether or not one's neighbor is in a state of civil war. So really, you have to take into account the total kind of, you need to take into account the regional space when you start to make this sort of calculation, my point of view, in which case, then, if we were to take just Britain as an example in the first instance, and then to ask about its neighbors, and one can make the case, indeed, I do make the case that this isn't a specifically British problem. These conditions are prevalent more or less throughout the Western world and very heavily throughout Western Europe. You have to then say, well, that it's very likely if it breaks out in any one place, it will spread to others. It's not a sure thing that it would spread, but it is quite likely. So if we just say arbitrarily that the chances of it transmitting from one place to another are, say, 50%, then, and the potential for it to break out exists in 10 or 15 different countries that are in close proximity and close connection, then that 18% again gets multiplied. As I said, I'm not a quantitative political scientist. I'm not trying a numbers game. I'm simply trying to say in human terms that there is a very significant probability of this occurring within 5 years on account of the existence of the indicative conditions for civil war being frankly, very obvious, and obvious across a range of countries which are connected in a manner which means that if it breaks out in one place, say Ireland or France or Germany, Italy, Portugal, Sweden, it will spread elsewhere.
Are we talking about, and I've heard you speak, and you speak very with a lot of nuance and about urban versus rural and all sorts of things, but are we essentially in the West talking about the issue of Islamism?
No. That is one half of the equation, in my view. I think there are two. I call them vectors, but let's call them. You choose your own term: aspect, factor. So I think there are two vectors. One is an interethnic conflict, which does have at its heart conflict with which we've been dealing as a society for coming on 25 years. 25 years now, is familiar to people. It's the subtext of the war on terror and much else. It is the factor which has driven much of the obvious reshaping of the urban landscape. So on and so forth. So that's one vector. The second vector is more of the nature, I think, of a peasant revolt. I'm not using this, I don't use the term peasant revolt in a disparaging manner. What I'm talking about is a form of internal conflict that arises out of a feeling amongst the majority populace that they have been, that the elite is changing the rules of the game in some way, which is seriously invidious of their potential well-being and against which they are reacting strongly.
91% watching Heretics Clips are not subscribed. Quick favor, hit subscribe. Free, takes 2 seconds, and helps us question everything together.